joysticks. We've been talking a lot about joysticks that are thumb activated or finger thumb activated, I guess in theory. I really need to clean my nails, don't I? Sorry about that. I've been working hard. And then this one. This is one of my favorites. Uses the PlayStation 2 type that I've used on a number of projects, non-adaptive projects, moving motors around and things like that. All nice one-handed. Neat design. I didn't do this original design. I just modified it so that you could put microcontrollers in there. Somebody else did this. Very nice. All right, but what happens when you can't manipulate a joystick? When you only have your finger, for example, to move something around? Well, in comes Stickless Joysticks. I've been working with a couple of people on the AT Makers group on Facebook where they have been working on the problem of how do you make a stickless joystick. And so I thought that was an interesting problem, and I started playing with a couple of different prototypes. So again, we have a situation where you might have very fine movements or very gross, wide-ranging movements. Tension is a big problem. You don't want things too stiff. Sometimes you want them very stiff. So the solution that works for one may not work for another, and the holy grail is finding sensors and things that will work for everybody, but I don't think we'll ever be there. Here is an example. This is only partially printed, so that's why it looks weird here, of a stickless joystick, and the main part is there, and there's an insert. Okay, so it's a 3D printed part. It's just a cylinder, but everything has been sized, and I'm using these test switches because they're what I had on hand, honestly. The 4 switches get mounted here. The distance is very important. There's a lot of fiddling and measurement about this, but the concept is that the person will put the finger in here and be able to hit the directions. Now these are regular on-off switches, so this is digital. This is not going to be analog. The springs on the switches themselves are what centers it. And I've tried to find the sweet spot where I can get a decent contact and still get it to return. I got to print out the whole thing and really give this a proper trial, but that's one example of a stickless stick. Another is I thought about capacitive. Now, capacitive switch is just a wire, a contact point that a finger needs to touch. It doesn't have to apply any pressure other than a touch, because just by getting close, and in fact, if it's set sensitive enough, you don't even have to touch it. You could just be close. And by close, it could be like 10 inches, which wouldn't work for a game controller, but keep that in mind for other projects. So in this case, I have a little design where 3D printed again, have some holes in it where I put an M5 screw into, and the user would tap it. There's only one screw in this one, but you get the idea. So tap, tap. The thing with this is this needs to be, this capacitive pickup point needs to be processed, and that requires a board and a microcontroller. This is a CAP 1188. It's a very standard 8 input capacitive sensor. I'm using this as a development board, so I have soldered on some screw terminals to make things easier. I'm going to post all these designs up once I'm happy with it, so you can have your own little setup. This will then be connected to the microcontroller, then the microcontroller will then be connected to the USB, which goes off to the PC or the Xbox or the Switch. So the thing about this, what I didn't like about this was extra parts. So I got some feedback from the AT Makers group, and one of the makers mentioned inexpensive capacitive touch pads, little tiny boards that already have kind of the brains on them. I've got some on order, which will hopefully arrive today, which I'm going to modify this design to use those little pads. You know, one of my mantras is I want to use Amazon or similar, which I consider Amazon the Radio Shack of the 21st century, because it's easy to get the parts. They're usually inexpensive. They get to you quickly. You don't have to have a commercial account. They're cheap. I always mention cheap, but cheap's important because if you look at the prices on a lot of this stuff, it can be crazy. The DIY approach is very often significantly cheaper. Okay, end of speech. The other concept I had for this, and I haven't gotten too far with it, is to embed magnets into my insert and use the magnets as the centering. So instead of, most joysticks use some sort of metal spring inside them to center them. In this case, I'm thinking about magnets. So you'd have, let's say, a magnet on that, then you have a magnet in this outer ring, and they'd be opposite polarity, so it, in theory, hold itself in the center. It's also one of those things that I fear that if you take the top off, everything will pop and go all over the place. But that's another idea to consider, is using magnets, which led me to using magnets as a sensor, which I've got sensor parts on order to test out that theory. So that is some of the beginnings of the Stickless Joysticks. Something to consider. These I've found are folks who have more of a heavy hand. So, you know, you really want something that's stable and strong, a wide enough base that you can attach to something or have some non-slip material on the bottom of it so it doesn't move around, and just heavy duty. These switches will all get screwed or glued in place eventually. So there you go, some more ideas. I'll let you know how things go. Talk to you soon.